Well, I'm delighted to be able to be moderating this panel on Muslim minorities and religious freedom in North America. We have yet another outstanding panel of experts who bring enormous expertise and experience to the question of the challenges and the opportunities that Muslim minorities face in North America, particularly the United States. So I'm delighted to be able to steer this conversation. As you noticed so far, we've had lots of outstanding speakers who don't need much steering, who are able to steer themselves. And here again, it's the same situation. Really outstanding panelists who bring diverse sets of experiences to this issue. I first want to just emphasize that what we want to discuss this afternoon, as we've been discussing all day, are first the challenges that Muslim minority communities face in terms of their practice of their faith. And here we'll be zeroing in on the experiences of Muslim minority communities in the United States and North America more broadly. But we also want to talk about the opportunities that living in the United States provides for Muslim communities in America. So we want to focus on both challenges as well as opportunities. And to lead us in this conversation, I'm delighted that we have scholars, experts, activists, people who, again, have enormous experience and credibility on these issues. First, we have Zareena Grewal, who is an associate professor in the departments of American Studies and Religious Studies in the program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University, to my immediate left. She's also the former director of the Center for the Study of American Muslims at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU. She previously was a visiting lecturer in Vassar College's Department of Anthropology. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters on the intersections of race and religion in American Muslim communities. Her book, Destination Tradition. Oh, okay. All right. Here we go. Very good. Excellent. This is a newer book, right? This is the book. This is the book. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Great. All right. Her latest book is Islam is a Foreign Country: American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority. She is also a documentary filmmaker and a regular contributor to the Huffington Post. To Professor Grewal's right is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an organization dedicated to preserving American founding principles by directly countering extremist ideologies. Dr. Jasser currently serves as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He has written numerous op-eds and articles on the challenges that Muslim communities face in America. He's also the author of a book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith, published in 2013. And then we have Farid Senzai at the to my far left, who is an assistant professor of political science at Santa Clara University, where he teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East politics. He is a fellow of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, that Professor Grewal has also contributed to. He's been a research associate at the Brookings Institution and a research analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he has served as a consultant for Oxford Analytica and the World Bank. He remains on the board of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and he's also contributed to several national and global surveys on Muslim attitudes. His publications include Political Islam in the Age of Democratization, just published last year in 2013. He's also contributed to the book Educating the Muslims of America, co-authored with Yvonne Haddad, who I'm delighted to say is here with us right now. Professor Senzai received his MA from Columbia University and his PhD from Oxford. Well, to begin to engage this very big question of the challenges that Muslim minority communities face in America, it may be useful just to flag a number of recent instances in which Muslim minorities in the U.S. have faced challenges with respect to their freedom to exercise their faith. One thinks of Nashala Hearn, the young woman in Oklahoma who, as a sixth grader, was told she could not wear her hijab by school officials. And it took the Department of Justice to file a lawsuit to win her freedom. In 2010, a Muslim community in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, began building a mosque and a community center. But soon, their plans incited a maelstrom of bigotry and hatred. A well-organized campaign was launched that significantly delayed their construction of their mosque. A county planning commission had tried to move that forward, but then later a judge ruled that the notice that the county planning commission provided was not enough, and that led to a delay in the construction of this mosque in Tennessee. Eventually, in August 2012, the mosque was open, but again, only after a long delay. In the last panel, we heard mention of anti-Sharia law campaigns, which have become widespread in America. Just to give one example, 70% of Oklahomans voted in November 2010 to amend the state constitution to forbid courts from considering Sharia law in their decisions. And most recently, perhaps, the U.S. Supreme Court is now taking its first hijab case to decide whether Abercrombie & Fitch can deny employment to an otherwise qualified young woman who wanted to wear a headscarf on the job. Samantha Iloff had applied to work at Abercrombie & Fitch, wore her black hijab to the job interview, was considered very well qualified as a result of the interview, but was denied the job. And this case is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. And representatives of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty are here, actually, who are involved in arguing that case and in providing briefs on that case. I want to just ask all of the members of the panel, are these incidents in which the religious freedom of Muslim Americans, are these incidents increasing? Are they decreasing? Are we seeing a kind of discouraging trajectory, or are we seeing a perhaps encouraging trajectory in terms of the religious freedom of Muslim Americans? Can I start with you, Farid?
Great. Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to be here. Many of the previous presenters in the previous panels sort of shed some light on the Muslim community in the United States. We heard from Shaykh Hamza as well as John Esposito talking about the diversity of this community. And so when one looks at this community, the first thing one has to note is how diverse this community is. In terms of the background of where these Muslims came from, whether they're indigenous Muslims born here or whether they're immigrant Muslims, and then the diversity that exists along ethnic and racial lines within the community, as well as then, as we heard from the previous panel, on the diversity of views that exists here within this community in terms of how they interpret their faith. And that then also goes to, of course, the way they practice their faith and the extent to which they actually practice their faith in this country. And so based on the polls that we had taken, and this includes polls that I've been involved with the Pew Research Center, as well as our own polls through ISPU and studies that I've done in the Bay Area, when one asks this question about discrimination, it depends on which Muslims you're speaking of and which Muslims feel that they are discriminated against. You see some Muslims that have integrated and been see themselves in the way that they look or dress, where their identity with Islam is not as strong, whether they see themselves as secular Muslims or cultural Muslims or Muslims just purely by name. And therefore, in their case, when you ask this question about discrimination, it comes out far less. They don't see it happening. But yet, you often see then when Muslims identify with their faith and appear in such ways which are then associated with Islam, whether it's a hijab for women or a beard, for instance, then you begin to see that the levels of discrimination goes up. And this then applies within the employment area as well in terms of job seekers, where a study that was done by the Carnegie Mellon University, and that study then looked at the question of employment, where individuals that had applied for jobs, just by changing their name to an American-sounding name, increased the odds that they would actually get the interview. And the difference was actually quite stark. Muslims that self-identified as Muslims were called back at a lower rate for job interviews than individuals that had names that were not Muslim-sounding.
It's about religion, not just ethnicity.
Exactly. So you begin to see in terms of how they identify themselves, where those that had Muslim-sounding names had fewer,
42% less.
Significantly fewer interview requests than those that did not. And so you then begin to see that when it comes to discrimination, sometimes the name alone can be reason enough to discriminate against a Muslim. But in terms of the overall trends, we are seeing significant uprise and rise in discrimination cases across the country. I'll give you just one example. That Muslims, of course, make up a very small minority of the population here in this country. Somewhere between 0.5%, if you believe the Pew Research Center study, or others suggest it's close to 2% of the national population are Muslims. But yet, according to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that of all the discrimination cases filed by religious communities and those that identified religiously, 1 out of 4 were Muslim. So you're looking at 1/4 of all discrimination cases are filed by Muslims, and yet Muslims only make up somewhere between 0.5% and 2%. So clearly the discrimination cases against Muslims far outweighs, or is higher than the population would suggest.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, and the Pew Research Center has data which suggests that in general there's a rise in restrictions on religion in the United States since 2007. Right. And some of that data would be tracking, I assume, some of the growing sense of restrictions on the part of Muslim communities in America. Zareena, can I ask you to address the same question? What do you think the trends are? But then also could I ask you to add your sense of why are we seeing the kinds of trends that we're seeing? Understandably, after 9/11, there was certainly a kind of spike in hate crimes against Muslims, but that was well over 10 years ago. Are we seeing a kind of a second spike in these kinds of trends?
It's
and if so, why?
Yes, it's counterintuitive. One would think that as we move away from September 11th that things should be getting better, but they're in fact not. In fact, with the election of Obama, the Obama administration, you actually have a rise in anti-Muslim fervor. I mean, the kind of grassroots mobilization, for example, over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque that happened in 2010, that was really, there wasn't any such apparatus in the kind of Islamophobic community, right? That they were able to garner that kind of activism and resources under Obama because they actually, there's a convergence of the kind of anti-black racism, anti-Obama feeling with the anti-Muslim. I mean, the cases you gave us of Oklahoma and Tennessee, there actually aren't a lot of Muslims living in Oklahoma and Tennessee. The lesson is that it doesn't take a whole lot of Muslims to create a massive sort of fervor and to get everyone sort of riled up around these issues. That's what's extraordinary. In fact, if we go back at the history of Sharia bans, you know, the earliest one in the 90s was actually in a rural part of Canada where there was not a Muslim for 100 miles in any direction, right? So in other words, the Muslim acts as like, it becomes a kind of phantom. The specter of Islam, the threat, doesn't actually require real Muslim bodies to generate the fear. So we need to think about that. I mean, there was a poll done that 62% of Americans have never met a Muslim. In other words, had zero social interactions with the Muslim. This is very different from Europe, where Muslims are a very sizable demographic. They're not in the US, as Farid pointed out. However, although 62% of Americans have not met a Muslim, 100% of Americans have opinions about Islam and what its problems are. Okay, that's what we need to be thinking about, is that how is it that we can know so little about this community and this religion and yet have such strong opinions about what's wrong with it and how it needs to be fixed and what the threat is. And so, you know, we need to, what I'd like to do is today is to, for us to try to frame these anxieties around Islam in terms of a larger racial picture. And when we do that, we'll see. So for example, if we look at, like, in LA, the surveillance apparatus that's been introduced by the LAPD, you know, that was intended to target the Muslim community. Basically, it's called the Muslim Mapping Project. And they're basically kind of, you know, spying on Muslim communities. And they're allowed under this program to create secret files and then go to a national database. So an oversight committee looked at this database of secret files. 82% of the files were on racial minorities. Most of them were black and not Muslim. What does this mean? Everyone should be concerned about Muslims losing their rights because you know, the Muslim community is so small. However, the target, in other words, the target of the surveillance machine is much larger than the Muslim community itself, even though, in other words, Muslims become the alibi for a number of policies that should be troubling for, I think, many people, particularly racial minorities.
And the same could be said about anti-Sharia laws, which have the potential to deprive not just Muslims but others of their basic religious freedoms, as has been pointed out.
Absolutely.
Including by the latest ISPU report, I believe, which was referred
I mean,
to
if I can just give one example to sort of highlight and underline the enormous ignorance about Sharia. Senator Allen was interviewed. He had proposed a Sharia ban, and he was interviewed by a journalist, a smart journalist, who asked him a very simple question: what is Sharia? You're proposing a ban on Sharia. What is Sharia? And he sort of stumbled with his papers and said, I'll have to have someone get back to you. He couldn't actually tell the reporter what Sharia was. And then he later released a statement explaining what Sharia was, and it was literally a cut and paste of the first paragraph from Wikipedia on what Sharia is. Now, unfortunately, he didn't include the second paragraph on Wikipedia. I mean, you can see the amount of research that's gone into this, right? Which actually explains that Islamic law has multiple interpretations and it's complex. And in other words, even the Wikipedia entry would have given him a little, you know, education on what Islamic law is. But that's what we're dealing with today for the American Muslim community and for all of us we're dealing with a discourse that is operating in a vacuum of knowledge. I mean, for example, my next book is going to be on the Quran and the American imagination, and Pew hasn't released the study yet, but they just did a poll. 50% of Americans cannot name the scripture of Islam, right? So that's pretty, I mean, this is, you know, Islam, Muslims do not suffer from a lack of representations. Islam is around you all the time. You turn on the TV, you hear about Muslims and Islam all the time. So it's not that there aren't too few representations of Islam. There's actually too many, but they're all the same note. And it's this very troubling racial note.
Zuhdi, Jasser, what's your sense of the basic trend lines in terms of religious freedom and then conversely religious discrimination for Muslim minorities in America?
Thanks, Tim, and I want to thank the Berkley Center and Tom Farr and all of you for including all of our voices and including some more diverse, controversial voices. And, you know, I have to say that the issue, obviously, when you frame the question about Sharia, about mosque, the rights to build mosques, et cetera, which are core American values. And I think this is why it's important to look at sort of what's the narrative and what's the lens that we look at this through. And if we spend an equal amount of time talking about the symptoms and what's happening in America, we should balance that with a discussion of, well, what is the problem? Where is this fear in America coming from? And, you know, we can sit and among people of peace and academia and say there's no problems and deal with Islamic apologetics over and over. But the reality is that every Muslim majority country that exists, whether it's populist movements, as we saw with the Brotherhood, or oligarchical movements, enact Islamic law in ways that are oppressive, demeaning to women, demeaning to minorities, etc. And to say somehow that our communities, plural, in America, bring those ideas over and become Jeffersonian Democrats overnight and enact the ideas of Thomas Paine and others that rejected theocracy, it might be easy to, in an apologetic, say that Islamic history was not theocratic in its entire history. The bottom line is the way I view it, is that these are all symptoms, and it is going to get worse. In Georgia, just last week, there was a hearing to prevent the building of a mosque. Right after 9/11 in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I live, a group of us defended the ability of us to build a mosque in Scottsdale. But those are symptoms of a community, American community, 60+% of whom, as she said, never met a Muslim. And Muslim minorities, while we can protect their rights, we have to remember in World War II, there was a movement to prevent the building of Japanese shrines and places of worship because of the conflict that we were under. And till today, the Nazi Party still exists freely, Communist Party, a lot of parties exist freely. And I think Egypt has proven that we can prove to the, whatever you want to call it, and I think there's been some demonization of the right today in that this is not a right-left movement. You can call it what you want, but these countries, as have been mentioned, whether it's Burma, which I visited earlier this year, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tajikistan, many of these countries have tried to push political Islamist movements underground, and it doesn't work. And I think that's where we need to appeal to Americans in that yes, there is a threat, but to push it underground actually makes it thrive. That's why the Brotherhood thrived for 60 years in Egypt, and 1 year of it running the government in Egypt made it fall apart. But in the American context, I think by making this all about woe is us, the Muslim minority, we're victims of this so-called Islamophobia. I mean, we're racializing Muslims. And there's a lot of comments I heard today that racializes a faith. Islam is an ideology. Anything that you can approach or leave at will is not a race, it's an ideology. That's not to say that there isn't bigotry against Muslims, but by making any criticism of Islam as a phobia, makes it really, you make the millions that went to the streets in Egypt against the Brotherhood, what were they fighting? Bahrain, just last week, the king of Bahrain made a statement against political Islam, saying that it is the plague of our society. The Egyptian government just had a commission that outlawed political Islam. Are we to believe that al-Sisi and the royal family of Bahrain are great liberal theologians? They're not. They're oligarchical Islamists who believe that the populist Islamists. So you have an internecine battle going in within the house of Islam that in America, looking at it through the lens of a minority, we're missing the boat. And as a doctor who treats disease, I don't treat symptoms. And I would tell you as a Muslim, I'll let the non-Muslim community deal with maintaining America's principles of religious freedom. And I think we are able to do that more so in America because it is a first freedom. In Europe, radical Islam is a bigger problem because the identity of the community's nationalism there is based on race and based on lands and history, while in America it's truly based on religious freedom. But where are the Thomas Paines of Islam? And I think it is relevant. Ideology is relevant if we're going to protect our country. While we shouldn't prevent the building of mosques, these laws called Sharia, anti-Sharia, again, as a Muslim, I would protest them being called anti-Sharia because Sharia to a Muslim means the pathway to the watering hole, which means God's law. So it's like saying Islam. But things done in the name of Sharia globally, for the most part, are not liberal. Talk to women's rights groups, talk to feminists that are working against not only honor killing, but honor violence, etc. And our organization has signed on to some of these movements, like the one in Michigan, the one in Arizona, the one in Florida. These don't cite Sharia. They say that any law in America that violates our American laws should be protected. That should not be protected, but should be countered. And this is the issue, is to say that somehow that there are no imams holding Islamic courts. Ask the British what's happening with Sharia courts in London and others. And in America, there are women that come to ask for a divorce and are told, oh, go back to your husbands. And these Sharia courts become incubators for the violation of women's rights. And it's not about Sharia, it's about draconian law, where we as Muslims have to address our scripture that says a woman gets half a vote of a man, she gets a quarter of the inheritance, that certain passages which I feel are misinterpreted and most Muslims feel are misinterpreted need to be readdressed. But the way to give women protection of that is to say that foreign law cannot be incubated in Sharia courts in America. They're called Sharia courts. But right now the arbitration system in America is so hands-off, which I as a libertarian believe, I'm sort of conflicted on this. But we're not at the same point in history as the Jewish court system is, the Christian court system is. And right now, I think we're more in the 17th, 18th century, and I think this is where the narrative has to be addressed.
So, but in answer to the question, do you think that there is a growing, do you have a growing concern about the treatment of Muslims in America? Are there problems? And you have a different understanding of why the problems are there, perhaps, but are there growing problems?
Yeah, there are. And I think just like a patient with cancer, as we treat the chemotherapy, you know, part of the treatment is going to create symptoms that hurt our community and are painful to deal with. And what is our, you know, what pulls Muslims to these radical movements is Islamo-patriotism, a belief in the caliphate, a belief in jihad, etc. Read this letter to Baghdadi that many imams, some of whom may be here, signed. It is an apologetic. It says the caliphate is right, but it needs to be done by a consensus. Well, what about condemning all caliphates? What about condemning all jihad? What about talking about women's equality? These are the things that we aren't doing, and I think the symptoms are going to get worse. Yes, it's going to continue to climb because the populist, activist, common media that addresses these issues in 7-second sound bites is going to stir the pot without treating the condition. And I think it's going to take a lot more Muslims to feel that we really have a problem. Most Muslims I talk to say, oh, Zuhdi, I like what you're doing, but gosh, I left that stuff in the Middle East because we're a minority, the Brotherhood will never take over the government here, it's just not an issue. Well, eventually, I think part of these pathological, the anti-mosque building movement is a pathology, the Muslim bigotry is a pathology, but that's going to motivate Muslims to finally say, what is our American national identity? Is it based on liberty, or are we Islamo-patriots who believe that we're here to not violate the laws and it's just really about violence?
Farid, Senzai, we've heard different points of view now. Zuhdi Jasser says, well, maybe the bigger problem isn't discrimination against Muslims, but extremism, or at least the danger of some Muslims turning extremist or absorbing extremist ideas. What's your assessment?
Well, the problem, unfortunately, in the comments just made are that there's an attempt to somehow equate what's happening in Muslim-majority countries with Muslims here, and attempt to somehow link politics there with politics here. Muslims in a minority situation and their views. Clearly, in many cases, as I mentioned, that Muslims are very diverse. Many of them have immigrated from Muslim-majority countries, and many of them have brought many of those cultural as well as religious views. But you see significant differences among Muslims. The fact that we even had this first session, the morning session, of the differences that exist within Europe. There's tremendous difference between German Muslims and French Muslims, and significant difference between European Muslims and American Muslims. Their history, their interpretation, their practice, then to let alone and then equate and begin to lump together Muslims in Egypt or the rest of Muslim-majority countries with Muslims in America, it's an attempt to really sort of link all of this together, which is unfortunate, because the point of our effort, especially today, is to begin to see the diversity and the differences that exist. And if one looks at Muslims in the United States, one sees that, yes, clearly there are Muslims that have very radical and, in many ways, extremist views that in some cases even support violence. We see that in the polls that were taken. The Pew poll that was taken, where 6% of Muslims had very extreme views when it came to violence, for instance. But yet, the vast majority of Muslims did not. And you see the condemnation of Muslims in this country against violence. And so to suggest that they're somehow apologizing for it is absolutely not the case. But one then has to look at the fact that, yes, there is a minority of Muslims in this country that has been either radicalized or has extremist views, and to find out why that is. The first thing one can, in fact, look at the age group. In the Pew study that we were involved with, in fact, we found that it was Muslims between the ages of 18 and 29, so Muslim youth, that had the most extreme views, and Muslims that were older than 29 had far less radical views. And then, in fact, when we talk about the extremist views, which goes sort of against the point that was just made, that it wasn't the immigrant Muslims that had the most radical views. Believe it or not, the ones in terms of racial lines, the ones with the most radical extreme views were African American converts to Islam that had the most more extreme or radical views. So you begin to see a significant difference that the immigrant Muslims were far more tolerant. In many ways, because they've come to the United States, they've had the opportunity to express themselves politically and see themselves engaging in a political process that has, in fact, de-radicalized, or in many ways allowed for them to participate in a way, and it's moderated Muslims. I mean, the Pew study, the 2007 study that came out, the title was Muslim Americans, Mostly Moderate and Mainstream. That was the title of the entire study. And therefore, yes, the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and mainstream. But yes, we did see the extreme elements within this community. One can't deny that. One has to look at that as to what the roots are of that extremism. Now, the unfortunate thing is, and this was the unfortunate thing when the 2007 study came out, I mean, every interview that I did, the first question was, what about those that support extremism or radicalism, or even support, for instance, suicide bombing, which was one of the questions that kept coming up. It really was an attempt to take this minority segment of the community and somehow conflate it with the entire majority of the community. And for us, who are actively involved in studying this community, is to show the diversity, to show that, yes, there is radicalism and extremism within a minority of the community, but the vast majority of the community has, in fact, overwhelmingly seen some of this as a problem and now attempting to try to do something about it, which, in fact, subsequent polls that have been done have shown that to be the case.
So you're arguing that a couple of interesting arguments. One, that the fact that there are not heavy legal restrictions on the freedom of American Muslims, in a way, is a kind of antidote to the possibility of radicalization. In America, we don't have bans on headscarves, we don't have bans on minarets, relative to some policies in Western Europe. So I want to ask, to what extent is that greater freedom a kind of antidote to radicalization and extremism? And then also, to your point that we are seeing movements within the Muslim community against extremism and radicalism, that seems to be directly counter to what Zuhdi Jasser was suggesting. Well, where are the Thomas Paines? Where are the liberal Muslims? You're suggesting that we are seeing them, and perhaps we've already seen them actually on display today. We've seen Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, founder of a liberal arts college in the United States, making extremely articulate arguments against Islamic radicalism. Aren't we perhaps seeing, as a result of kind of blending of Islam in the American context, a kind of fresh liberal Islamic discourse?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the scholarly literature on this topic, in terms of what they refer to as inclusion moderation, in terms of Muslims that have been included in the political process, has led to moderation. That, in fact, the more that they're included and allowed to participate through democratic means, through societies and within societies that are pluralistic, that then leads to moderation. And so therefore you begin to see direct links between inclusion leading to moderation. So I think that the evidence suggests that's the case. The second question, part of it was?
Are we seeing a kind of fresh
Yes.
liberal Islamic discourse in the United States, in part because of the relatively religiously free environment?
Yeah, I think that what you're seeing is, you're seeing this new generation of Muslims that, it's really exciting to see, as John Esposito pointed out in the previous panel, that you see this new generation of Muslims that identify with Islam. Now, the question was, to what extent do they identify with Islam? We're seeing with the studies that large percentage of Muslims do, in fact, identify, self-identify as being Muslim. In fact, in some cases, Muslim first. as their primary identity.
Despite the fact they may not be mosque attenders, even if mosque attendance is 15%
well,
or so?
I would actually argue that it's much higher.
It's higher than
that.
That,
in fact,
okay.
Our Bay Area study that we found that it was significantly higher, between a third and a half in the study there. But overwhelmingly, if you look at national studies, Muslims are about a third is what the most scholars suggest, that it's about a third that are mosque attending. Now, of course, then within mosque attending, you see the diversity of whether they're going once a week or they're just going to what they refer to as the Eid prayer, or in fact, they go every single day. And so you have a tremendous diversity of what constitutes a mosque goer. But the point is that in terms of their identity, Muslims, overwhelmingly, many of them see themselves as Muslim, but then they don't see it in conflict with being American, and so they see themselves as Muslim and American. Just as if you ask Christians, and it's interesting because the Pew study, in fact, equated this and looked at the Christian community, and many of them also identified very much with their Christian identity, but also American. So there was actually parallels along those lines. But then the question of what is happening with this community, or do we have the new voices that support liberal ideas and what Zuhdi is referring to, we are seeing that, and we're seeing that, but also insisting on maintaining this Islamic identity. And that's the key point, is that while they are not assimilating to the point where they are washing away their religious identity. A percentage are, where they're changing their names and they don't at all identify with Islam. But the majority of Muslims are what we refer to as integrated Muslim or integrationist Muslims, where they are integrating without losing their identity. And you see this generation of Muslims establishing new institutions, being voices that support and fully advocate for the principles that this country was founded on, but yet proudly Muslim as well.
Right, not privatizing their faith, not abandoning it. Professor Grewal, I wanted to ask you to comment on the discussion we've had so far, but I'd like to just ask another question to add on to the discussion. You've done fascinating work on the links between Muslims in this country and Muslim networks abroad. So I'd like to ask you, again, to comment on what's been discussed, but also to ask you a question that was asked in the Europe panel, namely, is there a way in which these new voices that we're seeing in the U.S., are they having an influence in other parts of the world? Shaykh Hamza, we know, has had a real influence in Islamic discourse, not just in this country, but elsewhere. Are there other examples of that happening? Muslim Thomas Paine's, or maybe that's not the best analogy, given Thomas Paine was a pretty...
I think it's the best analogy.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, he was famously a deist and not exactly a fan of Orthodox Christian theology. But I understand the point that are there examples of...
So I didn't get the memo that you have to prove that you're Thomas Paine to have the rights as a citizen in this country. I didn't know that was the new criteria under which Muslims are being asked to perform their citizenship, first of all. I mean, I wrote a book about American Muslims who exactly fit the profile that make many Americans nervous. Young people, politically disaffected, very religious. And I interviewed hundreds of them who had gone abroad to study Islam traditionally, and that was 10 years of research. But I find myself encountering people on panels such as these who, I have to confess, I don't know Dr. Jasser until today, but I've never met you before, but I do feel like I know you because I watch Fox News every day. And so I have to say, I'm glad you're here. I'm having heart palpitations as you talk about Sharia, so maybe you can help me afterwards. I don't know, but
I mean, the media over half of the American population watches, by the way.
I mean, I'm counted among them, I guess. My concern is that when we talk about Islam having a cancer, first of all, that itself is a problem. I think that kind of analogy and that kind of language.
Islam has a cancer. Islamists, Muslims have a cancer with it.
Okay. I consider Islamists to be Muslim. So, okay, if you would, I would count them among the billion Muslims.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So if they, in fact, have a problem, maybe it would be helpful if we actually understood a couple things about them. So in other words, I mean, I was born with a heart. I don't get invited to speak at cardiology conferences, okay? However, there are many people, because they were born Muslim, and they're ready to say, certain things, they become overnight experts about Islam and they're willing to say, and so when you ask the question, where is the fear of Islam coming from? There is a multi-million-dollar industry that manufactures fear of Islam. That is a fact. The Fear Incorporated is a wonderful report that was published a couple of years ago, which sort of shows how this happens. The Sharia bans all come from one website with a boilerplate that can be used in any state by any public official, and that's how this happened. I mean, this is not like, it's not a great mystery of where did this come from. As for the question of the racialization of Islam, Muslims aren't the ones who are saying Islam is a race. The state has racialized Muslims. That is what has happened. In fact, when I say that Islam is racialized, what I mean by that is also that we have a category of Muslim-looking people now. Many of the targets of hate crimes that are intended for Muslims are not themselves actually Muslims. Sikhs, Native Americans have died. Latinos have died because they were presumed to be Muslim, okay? So that's what I mean when I say Islam is racialized. Now, in a post-civil rights America, we don't have policies that are anti-Islam or that are racist at the face, but they're racial in their effects. In other words, the war on terror policies that are immigration policies, that are focusing on charities. 6 Muslim charities were shut down post 9/11. I mean, this is selectively, these are laws and policies that are selectively targeting particular Muslim populations. That's racial in its effect, even if it's not called racial. So, for example, after 9/11, 42%, the Muslim charitable work, the amount of money that left the U.S. From Muslim pockets, was reduced by 42%. When we look at the incredible humanitarian crises in Syria and elsewhere, and all of that money is not able to even get to those locations because Muslim giving is so constrained. At the exact same moment, under Bush, George W. Bush, faith-based organizations that were evangelical and Christian were receiving more funds from the government than they had ever had before. So it's the selective application of these laws is in fact racial. If we can get past the face of it, it's not called racial. It's not like the Asian Exclusion Act, which said Asians couldn't come here, but the deportations are all mostly Asians from Pakistan, actually. So we have to be able to look a little deeper to actually study the issue and see what's going on here. What you see now is that Muslim charities have to rebrand themselves as not charities, because charity is seen as religious and therefore suspect, but as humanitarian. Right? So humanitarian work is seen as secular and somehow devoid of this dangerous religious quality. And so that's very troubling. So in other words, zakat practices, the Muslim requirement, which is part of Sharia, which is having to give charitable donations once a year, right? That is constrained by the state, and it deeply impacts Muslim communities. Now, it also has unexpected effects. So for example, because Muslims are not able to give so easily outside of the US, the square footage of mosques has, I think, doubled in some states such as Michigan since 9/11, because Muslims are essentially investing domestically in projects like Zaytuna College, their local mosque, Islamic schools, things like that. This is not what the, this is not the intended effect for these policies, but that's one of the, I guess, good things that's come out of it for the Muslim community. As for the question of radical Muslims, I mean, this book is basically about radical Muslims. It's unfortunate that the term radical has itself become a slur. When I say radical Muslim, we immediately assume that we're talking about someone who's about to behead you if you're not exactly like the way they are. That's very troubling. We have
Law's made this point earlier today.
Yeah, and I want to underscore that point. I think that's exactly right, and I really appreciate that he titled his book "Radical," and we need to recuperate that term. It's precisely this aversion to being labeled radical that you see American Muslim leadership making terrible mistakes. This weekend, I find this embarrassing. The Muslim Public Affairs Council honored the LA police what's his name? I can't remember. I wrote it down. Chief Michael Downing. Okay. Now he got the Community Partnership Award from MPAC in LA over the weekend. This is the same weekend that the whole country is seeing thousands and thousands of people pouring into the street protesting police violence. Isn't that offensive to the families and the victims and all those people out protesting for justice? For this Muslim organization to be congratulating LA's police department, who has one of the most one of the most aggressive and disturbing surveillance programs in the country that's been a model for other states. But you see this desire to not be seen as radical, to be seen as good Muslim patriots. They're making all kinds of mistakes. To me, the real hope is actually in. You were saying, are there liberal voices? Yeah. I think there's a liberal vacuum, actually, in the Muslim community, which I would like to see. I would like to see American Muslim leaders that are aligning their activist energies with the people that are in the streets that are so inspiring. All the White House staffers that came down the stairs saying, "I can't breathe," with signs, and Black Lives Matter. This is the moment. This is the movement of the moment, and it affects us Muslims too. We should be. That's where we need to see a kind of convergence of energies, rather than these dinners giving awards to people who are at best frenemies.
Zuhdi, would you like to respond to anything that's been said?
Well, I find it amazing that in the United States of America, an educated opinion about Islam gets dismissed because some of us don't have degrees in theology. That is entirely against what our founding fathers, what America was based on, is that Muslims who understand and who believe in their scripture, who have a kitab as part of my marriage, who believe in Sharia and my personal practice of faith and my dietary restrictions, all my personal practice. If I take on Sharia and government, then I become uneducated about Islam, I become anti-Muslim, become part of this Islamophobia industry that she nonchalantly mentioned. When in fact you'll find this industry has a lot of overlap with some of the groups that fund organizations like Georgetown and others. So at the end of the day, that industry is reacting to an ideological problem that, by the way, is a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of dollars spent by OIC countries, billions from Saudi Arabia, all the Emirates, and other radical monarchies that are spreading ideology of Islam in the name of our faith that is still in the 12th and 13th century. And unless we address these things, if we continue to get warmth in our blanket of American freedom, we are going to miss the boat as far as where we are in the time of history. Now, I'm not disagreeing with some of the symptoms that exist, and I talked about how we are fighting some of those front lines, but the issue I see it is, what is the worldview of Muslims and the leadership? And I would tell you that most of the Muslim organizations and imams leading our communities have a pretty singular worldview about the role of Islam in government. Now, you can separate them into Salafis and the debates about the Brotherhood versus Salafism and all that, but the worldview, and this isn't hyper-American patriotism as we get dismissed, and you dismiss 60% of American population as these bigoted conservatives and hyper-patriots. You can call it whatever you want. It's about liberty. It's about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and those of us that are trying to fight for those ideals within the House of Islam and portray where we are as Muslims in this time of history. Because left to their own devices, what is Islamism? Yes, Islamists are Muslims, absolutely. But I want to have that dialogue not about violence and what is an extremist. I don't even know what that is. It's about somebody maybe that wants to do whatever they want militantly. But the difference between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda is really the means. They dismiss violence, they dismiss all these other things, but what is their worldview when they become a majority? And if they become a majority, it's relevant, because in America, we can do this work to counter Islamism. Islamism is the belief in the Islamic State when Muslims are a majority, and that ultimately they will put into place not systems based in reason and the separation of church and state, but a system based in which the ulama or the scholars decide by consensus what the law should be, and the population does not do so through reason and through a reason process, rather just as the West abandoned canon law, etc. The Islamists want to put into place a theocratic type of mindset, and I think that's really important for us to understand where we are in this time of history. We can't dismiss this debate, because when you dismiss it, you actually perpetuate the separation of the debate from the realities that we need to confront.
Well, let's broaden the debate and get people in the audience. I know we'll have a microphone going around, so perhaps we can begin with Majid Nawaz here in the front. Thank you. Thanks, Olivia. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, I know I've spoken, but I thought I'd take the liberty because I was referred to, so I thought I'd just take the speaker's liberty to comment on some of what I've just heard. I am in this peculiar position that I've been on both sides of what we've just heard in this very important dialogue, and it shouldn't be dismissed. I am somebody who spent a long time arguing for the Islamist worldview that Zuhdi Jasser just referred to, and as a Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate in London, care deeply for the liberal issues that were referred to before Zuhdi's comment. And often it's frustrating to me as somebody who approaches this debate from a liberal perspective to see the dichotomy whereby one is either perceived of as a hyper-patriot, as Zuhdi referred to, and if they're critical of Islamism, or a liberal who is expected or it's anticipated that a liberal is somehow inherently sympathetic to Islamism if they don't criticize it enough. And what I would like the speakers to comment on is actually that there is no reason why these two perspectives should be at odds. There's no reason why the debate should be polarized in that way. It's simultaneously true that there's a rise of the symptoms of anti-Muslim hate across Europe. In particular, I'm aware of the European context. It's simultaneously true that Muslims must participate more in things such as, I Can't Breathe campaigns and everything we're seeing in the social justice movements across America at the moment. And it's simultaneously true that there's a diversity within Muslim communities, while it's also true that there is a very, very unhealthy strand of discourse referred to as Islamism that is attempting to crush that diversity within our own communities. And so I just want the speakers to comment on why there's a tendency, and I sometimes see it as laziness, intellectual laziness perhaps, to fall into these comfortable zones.
Sort of either or.
Yeah, when actually all of this can be done and needs to be done by liberal voices more so. If we want to stop anti-Muslim hate, it's even more important for liberal voices who also happen to be Muslim, who also happen to care about other social justice causes, as part of their desire for social justice, to care about the stigmatization that happens by Muslims to other Muslims within their own communities, what I referred to earlier as the minorities within minorities context. We are traditionally very bad at catering for dissenting Muslim voices, whether they're Ahmadis or Muslims who choose to leave their faith. We are very, very intolerant, generally as communities, especially in Europe, of those dynamics. And just as we expect, I'll stop here, just as we expect non-Muslims to speak out against anti-Muslim hate, we must also speak out against Islamist extremism and hate within our communities for minority Muslim voices as well, or people who choose to leave the faith.
Farid, would you like to?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot to respond to. I think that, Jocelyn had done a good job in the first session discussing sort of the diversity within Islamism. And so once again, let's not fall into the trap of identifying a Islamism. I think there is, my entire book, in fact, everyone's promoting their book, so.
Please.
So, my book has 11 chapters. Each chapter is on a different manifestation of Islamism. And each one has a very different history and has quite distinct and different opinions about many of these issues, whether it's liberalism or whether it's democracy, whether it's violence, all of these things. And so you see that within Islamism, there is a tremendous amount of diversity. So to suggest that Islamism, once again, is in the United States and it's here and it's dominated and there's sort of one perspective of it, it's absolutely not the case. Clearly, Muslims see that Islam should play a more important role in the public sphere, first of all personally, but also in some cases you see Muslims that say that it should play a more important role in the public sphere. It's no different than you know, you ask Jerry Falwell and 60 million evangelical Christians if they think that Christianity should play a role in the public sphere. Absolutely sure. What do you think the abortion debate's about? What do you think that same-sex marriage is about? This is all about allowing religion to play a role in the public sphere. And so Muslims have every right to have that. In fact, that's what makes America so great, is to allow for your diversity to play a role in the public sphere. And then to fear that and to suggest is very unpatriotic, because the history of this country is based on the diversity of religious views. The problem that I have with those that try to advocate and inflame the hatred against Muslims and Islamophobia is to somehow suggest that Muslims are un-American, to the point where our President of the United States, because his middle name is Hussein, there's still 20% of Americans think that he is a Muslim, and they still continue to advocate that. That's what I object to. And the problem, and part of my effort, and Zareena's effort, and others, is to try to show this diversity. Yes, there's extremism and radicalism within the community, but yet because of this diversity, Muslims have just as much right to express their faith, whether it's in the personal arena or within the public sphere, just as the 60 million evangelical Christians do, or not to mention Hasidic Jews or Orthodox Jews in this country that do the same. And so to somehow to suggest that Muslims are different than other Americans because of this is, I think, is unfortunate, and it's come to that. I would hope that a conference like this begins to shed light on and express views that are contrary to that.
And I just briefly want to reject the notion that a Muslim who is against the Islamic State and against having a citizen's identity through their faith is somehow not for family values, could not be pro-life, could not be pro-family values, and all the other aspects that we look at, conservative Christian movements, conservative Jewish movements, and all people of faith, that the discussion of religion in the public place for America in 2014 is very different from where we are versus the Islamist movement within the Muslim consciousness today. The Islamist movement right now is, and the Muslim majority conversation within mosques, within Muslim majority countries, I believe there's a lot of differences with Christendom in the West, but I believe is a revolution such as our founding fathers fought in the 17th and 18th century. And that's what the Arab awakening is unroofing. And the bottom line is the front line ideologically. We may want to focus on violent extremism at the end, but the beginning of the Imam Awlakis, the beginning of the conversation is to demonize Western liberalism and secularism as anti-religious, and to then say that the ulama and the scholars need to control society to keep it clean, versus the populist understanding that even a Jew, even an atheist could become president of your country, versus the Islamic worldview, which is rights come from Islam and not from God, and that you need to have a Muslim a lens through which to view it. That's the debate and where we are today. But I resent the fact that somehow if you're against the Islamists, or if you don't go to mosque, which we said already 85% of American Muslims don't do for the most part, that somehow you're not religious, when in fact in Islam, my parents in Syria used to go to a different mosque every weekend, every Friday, because there's mosques on every corner. There was no congregational concept. So the fact that you don't go to mosque doesn't make you not religious. It makes you sometimes maybe just repulsed from the leaders and the pulpit and what you're going to hear in the sermons in many of the mosques in America.
Question? Shaykh Hamza.
Yeah, this has been very interesting.
It's going to be hard for you to keep this brief, I suspect.
I will. I'll keep it very brief.
Right.
I just, I think Dr. Jasser brought up some very valid points about what's happening with the vast amount of money that has been spent on promoting a certain type of Islam that I find very odious. But I just want to, Chesterton said that tradition was the democracy of the dead. So I want to defend the 13th and 14th century scholars that Dr. Jasser thinks these people represent. They don't. If the 13th and 14th century scholars were actually here today, it would be a very different situation. You wouldn't be seeing the type of violence that you're having here. And that's simply a fact. For somebody that spends more time with them than with people. So my only problem with a lot of what Dr. Jasser said is I think instead of using a scalpel, he's using a sledgehammer. And I think he needs a little more nuance in his approach. That's all. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. You want to respond to this?
Well, I don't disagree with him. I mean, if we're going to have we could do a whole panel on apostasy and the fact that Ibn Taymiyyah and many of the scholars said in the 12th and 13th century that we should. Well, well, we can have that debate, but the bottom line is, as Shafi'i. But okay, so the bottom line is most of the legalisms. There used to be 4,000 schools of thought of Islam. Now there's 4. So it has narrowed itself down. And the interpretation of Shafi'i school of thought that says if you leave Islam, kill them, is still distributed in the reliance of the traveler at major Muslim organizations as being our Sharia. So if this is such a whitewash, where are all of the Muslim leaders condemning Shafi'i interpretations or the other schools of thought that came out of 12th and 13th century interpretations?
I want to actually get a couple of questions in, one after another, and then have a response. Yes, this gentleman's been waiting. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Each Muslim who reads the Quran.
Could you identify yourself, sir?
Hassan, my name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran. I am a builder developer retired, and I have an organization called Global Bridges for Humanity, which I hope to do what you all doing in much, much bigger basis. Quran gives the answer to all the questions. Quran does not say if you don't believe in Quran, you should be pushed away. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we send Muhammad as a blessing to all the things. Rahmat lil alameen. Therefore, there is no Islamist, there is no extremist, there is no fundamentalist in Islam. Islam is only one Islam, and that is Islam, a pure Muhammad.
Okay, thank you. Then in the back, yeah.
Hi, my name is Fevzi Bilgin. I would like to actually thank Mr. Jasser about his comments. I think he is pointing out to a very serious problem among Muslims, us, that we spend too much time not confronting our problems, and we have been looking for apologies. It's, if Muslims are violent, backward, have problems, poor, whatever, this is because colonialism, because this is because of this and that and so on. I'm from Turkey originally. I'm very familiar with this discussion. So I think it's a very important part of the problem. And most of the time in Muslim societies, the fight is not between different sects, sectarianism, but between religious and secular groups.
Could you just bring it to a question, please?
Religious and secular people. And it is so difficult to reconcile these two groups most of the time. It's because, you know, there are historical issues, but there are also this kind of apologetic way of looking at the things without addressing the issues. And sometimes you have a hope, you have some sort of an opportunity that arises, like in Turkey. You have very powerful Muslim Democrats taking over and so on, and then they are now kind of 2 degrees away from being Muslim brothers. So sometime, you know, you have to address the issues that why mostly in Muslim societies are radicalizing and taking this as a proud part of an aspect of their identity and not trying to address it. And sometimes even taking opportunity of the freedom, religious freedom and so on that is found in the Western societies. Just one, I'm closing, just one suggestion to Mr. Jasser is when you put it, your mission, let's say, in context with an American ideals, you have, of course, problems that you may be associated with Fox News and so on. Then you have to deal with Second Amendment, whether I need to have gun as a Muslim and so on. So instead of that, if you basically expand your horizon and make this as an Islam that is more in harmony with universal rights and freedoms, which is above American founding ideals, I think, and more improvised, so to speak. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, please. You want to respond right away?
Yeah, if I could just say a couple things. First of all, I'll just say this. I just had a baby, actually. I'm on maternity leave, but I came here because I think this issue is very important. Thank you. He's very cute. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, but I made an exception because this issue is very close to my heart. My husband is Iraqi. His family is living under ISIS in Mosul right now. These issues are very close to my heart. However, all I'm trying to say is that if we're going to talk about these issues, we need to at least come to the table with evidence. The reality is that there's so much anxiety in the US. In fact, one of the questions in the earlier panel about minorities in the Muslim world. If you look at the news coverage of the Muslim world, the treatment of Christians, which is often very bad, the treatment of homosexuals, which is also very often very bad. These are the kinds of things that covered again and again and again about the Muslim world. What's often glossed over, and this is what people don't understand about what happened in Egypt, is that the government also persecutes the religious majority in most Muslim countries, such as Egypt. That Sunni majority, okay, is also targeted. That's what people often don't understand. And so it's come to the point now where Muslim Brotherhood equals, I don't know, something deeply alarming, which it shouldn't, as Farid pointed out. My trouble with those who are able, I mean, what I've seen over the since September 11th is seeing Muslim institution after Muslim institution in the US collapsing under basically guilt by association. Even organizations that have no religious element to them. So for example, Kind Hearts, which is a totally secular Lebanese charity out of Toledo that was for giving money to orphans. Because somebody somewhere might have met with somebody who met with Hamas, their assets were frozen. The ACLU took the case, they actually won the case, and that's a success story. But you know, the idea that every Muslim organization, whether it's ISNA or CARE or all these sort of mainline Muslim organizations in the US, if they have any connection at all to the Muslim Brotherhood, they're actually a terrorist organization. This is actually what we see under the Obama administration. Under Bush, it was good Muslims and bad Muslims, like the jihadists who hate America, and then all the good Muslim citizens. Under Obama, this Islamophobia discourse treats the entire American Muslim population as a giant sleeper cell that's about to be awakened, and then we need to have Sharia bans in place for the moment that they all wake up from their trance-like state and take over America. I mean, this is not helpful for anybody. And the reality that you don't even have to present evidence. I mean, that was the case with the Kind Hearts. They didn't have to show any evidence that that there was a link to any so-called terrorist group. And by the way, the list of who's a terrorist group is also constantly in flux, what the state considers terrorist groups. So.
But a couple more minutes.
Okay.
I just want to at least get at least a couple more questions if possible. Imam Magid was waiting, I think, patiently for some time. So. Yeah.
Since the morning, I've been listening to this discourse. I would like to say that you might have frustrated Muslim and angry Muslims with Muslim community, and you might have an angry Catholic with the Catholic community, an angry Jewish with the Jewish community. But in order for us to address the anger, why are you angry with all the Jewish organization or all the Catholic organization? I think you need to have an open debate. And I appreciate this debate taking place here. But I would like to say that you have to be very careful in addressing the issue of the need of creating a very tolerant and understanding religious community. You cannot exclude the people who disagree with you in all sides, because sometimes I have someone come on TV, want to exclude everybody who does not agree with them, and he call them like those are the terrorist organization, those are this and that, and we have Muslims who will exclude someone like Dr. Jasser and said you should not have a voice. I would like to say that it cannot be inclusive unless you accept exclusive. Because the debate today in the Muslim community, in the interfaith dialogue, has to include everybody. But I would like to say in the last point that my experience as an imam, you have to accept a person who wears a niqab I cannot tell them wearing niqab is not the right thing to do, covering their face, burqa, or a person doesn't wear a scarf. Our mosque is open for all. But having anyone to say that Muslim American should be different from the Jewish American and Catholic and others, who they have elements within them who are conservative, liberal, and others. For someone to say we need Muslims to be liberal, to be conservative, why don't you accept the Salafis and everyone else in this country, and the Sufi and everyone else, like any other community except in diversity, and no one manipulate Islam. It's just accept it as like any other community. Why has to be somebody says it has to look like this to be a true Islam? Accept the diversity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. Yes, in the front too, yeah. Yes, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
My question is to Dr. Jasser. It's very interesting to hear how the government plays out, the U.S. Constitution and the government in this issue. And I just wanted to know what you thought about, you're into medicine, right? And so we have health. And if a person is sick and doctors just treat him through biomedical things all the time, which is like the situation of the whole U.S. society right now, we know that this is like the society with the worst health and the most expenses, and whatever happens, nobody can really cure this, have an answer to this healthcare problem, because the libertarians and the liberals are fighting on if healthcare should be inclusive or not, and the whole free market system, and it's a very complicated thing. I think that so in this context, excuse me, don't you think that public health and medicine is like, for example, public health and medicine in America is like, America is like the Muslim people, and public health could be addressing the socioeconomic factors that are actually affecting the health of the Americans, and medicine is just trying to cut off the cause of disease, because health in medicine is the absence of disease. But we have to look at the socioeconomic factors that keep perpetuating the reasons why people have diseases, and some of these things are like the urban environment and the safety and the security of the place, education.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much. We do need to move to close the panel. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make closing comments, perhaps in dialogue with some of the questions and comments we've just heard the last few minutes, but feel free to make general closing comments as well. We'll start with Farid and continue over to Zuhdi, and then
Well,
Zareena.
I don't have much more to add. I think I've essentially made my major points. I think that one of the things to note or to keep in mind as we deal with these very important and complex issues is that we're seeing a tremendous amount of positive change that's taking place. I mean, I think in many ways the role that someone like Dr. Jasser plays within the community is a very healthy and important role. You're seeing that the community is looking much more internally in terms of some of the issues that it faces and some of the problems that it faces. You're seeing this as a community that is evolving in many ways, from the concerns that they had in the 60s, for instance, to the concerns that they had in the 80s or 90s, to the concerns they have in a post-9/11 world. And I think that this is a healthy process that's taking place. From the places and the issues, the organizations that they fund, for instance, where initially they were funding mosques and they were very interested in establishing their places of worship, to then building and establishing these civil rights organizations like CARE, for instance, and Impact that were established. Then to see this transition where you're seeing the next generation of Muslims building organizations and institutions as well as colleges like Zaytuna College as well. You're seeing this evolution that's taking place. Part of this evolution is to begin to also look internally at some of the problems. And so I think that the community is beginning to do that. In some ways, it's understanding that it has to do that to address the radical or extreme elements within the community, and to not just completely ignore it. But as I've continually said, that one has to keep this in perspective to say that that it's not that the entire community supports this, and that you begin to see the diversity that's there.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, Zuhdi and Zareena, quickly, if I may.
Yeah. I mean, I just have to say that I approach this from a position of love for my faith, for my country, and for my beliefs and the centrality. I mean, I think de Tocqueville got it right that democracy works in America because we have a faithful religious population that don't need a military regime in order to work. Having said that, as in response to Imam Majid and some of the other comments, the reason the Islamic question for Muslims regarding liberty, religious liberty, the way our founding fathers defined it, is so relevant is because our constituency is not just 1% of the American population. The constituency for what we write and produce about liberty versus Islamism is the 25% of the world's population that's Muslim, that's going through an Arab awakening, that's switching right now between Islamism versus Arab fascism. In the middle is lost, a liberty movement. Tunisia divided into 50 different parties that could have united under liberty, and Nahda won because the Islamists were united versus maybe the Salafists. That unification of the West under liberty, I believe, is the future to taking away the fear in America that's creating these questions of, and I think, pathological manifestations of preventing mosques, et cetera, because we're not addressing the issue of is our perceptions of Islam compatible with Western modernity and Islamism? And I think this has to be approached not only as an American issue, but as an issue of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights versus the Cairo Declaration that rejected a lot of that.
Last word.
Okay, so just very quickly. 50 years ago, Islam was seen as a learned tradition by most Americans and also associated with some kind of concept of social justice. That is no longer the case, unfortunately. Most Americans don't link those things. That is a shame. And I think that the American Muslim community needs to think long and hard about that fact. However, that's within the community. The issue of radicalization and have jihad. These are all issues worth tackling. Whether you want to talk about theological issues like apostasy laws, should Islam be reformed? That's a live debate. I wrote 400 pages about it. You can read. I mean, Muslims have thought of this question before today. That idea is there. Okay. However, the larger problem for the American Muslim community is actually not theological debates or legal debates about apostasy and other things, or hijab and all of this. The real problem is that there is a they're in a very politically precarious position in the U.S. Maybe not as bad off as some people and Muslims in Europe and other places, but they are vulnerable. And I think what we need to challenge is the very basic concept that more surveillance, more policing, more criminalization of the Muslim community at large makes us safer. It doesn't. The evidence shows us that it doesn't. That's what we need to turn our attention to, is that what are we willing to sacrifice to feel safe? And for me, our commitment needs to be not only to Salafi American Muslims or atheist Americans. I mean, I think we need to commit for all of us being able to retain our rights as citizens, regardless of what our religious identity is, or whether we even have one or not. That's the premise of our kind of political foundation.
Thank you very much. Well, please join me in thanking this outstanding, vigorous panel.